In the early hours of 2 a.m. on October 26, 1942, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page crouched behind a Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun on a soaked ridge overlooking Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, watching faint lights flicker through the jungle nearly 300 yards away as rain slid across the mud-soaked ground around him and his men. He was only 24 years old, yet he had already spent 6 years as a Marine machine gunner. And now 33 Marines depended on him as the Japanese 17th Army prepared to send nearly 1,700 soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division straight toward the thin southern line. Page and his platoon had captured the airfield 2 months earlier, and the Japanese were determined to retake it because without Henderson Field, American bombers could not reach Japanese supply routes, and if those bombers stopped flying, Japan would tighten its grip on the Pacific with this at stake. Page had placed 4 Browning M1917 machine guns along a 1,500-yard ridge. Each weapon weighed more than 90 pounds even before water and belts were added, and each needed 3 trained Marines to operate at full efficiency. Page had drilled every man relentlessly, teaching them to field strip the gun blindfolded so they could clear jams in total darkness. Because he knew combat left no room for hesitation, he understood that the southern ridge was the weakest point in the American perimeter. If the enemy broke through this location, they could reach Henderson Field in 20 minutes and destroy every bomber, fighter, and transport on the island. The loss of Guadalcanal would follow, and with it the Pacific supply corridor to Australia. Everything came down to holding this single stretch of jungle and mud. Earlier that evening, Page had rigged a crude tripwire system ahead of his position, threading wire through bushes and hanging empty ration cans with brass cartridges inside, so that if enemy soldiers brushed against it, the cans would rattle and give his Marines perhaps 30 seconds of warning. It was simple but reliable. At 2:45 a.m., the cans rattled and Japanese artillery began pounding the ridge. How? Its shells exploded through the trees, raining splinters and shrapnel across the positions and shaking the earth while rain hammered mud underfoot. Page could hear voices drifting up from the darkness, Japanese soldiers singing and smoking, moving confidently toward what they believed would be a swift victory over the thin Marine line. At exactly 3 a.m., the first wave of attackers burst from the jungle. Page gave the order to fire, and all 4 Browning guns roared to life. Red tracer rounds cut through the rain as Japanese ranks collapsed one behind another. The Marines had memorized the distance to every feature across the slope. They had rehearsed for this moment, knowing precisely where each belt of fire would land, yet the Japanese kept charging, climbing over their fallen comrades, surging forward with officers brandishing samurai swords and soldiers hauling Bangalore torpedoes to rip apart the wire. The enemy numbers did not seem to end. For every man who fell, 2 more appeared. Page saw hundreds still moving through the trees behind the leading wave, and the sheer volume of bodies pressing upward began to feel like a tide. By 4 a.m., 2 of the 4 machine guns were knocked out by grenades that killed their crews. The gun pits filled with blood and rainwater as Page scrambled along the ridge, directing fire, clearing jams and pulling wounded Marines away from the firing line. A Japanese soldier lunged from the dark and drove a bayonet into Page's left hand, nearly severing his fingers, but Page struck back with his fighting knife and kept moving. By 5 a.m., only 1 gun still fired. By 5:30, Page looked left and right and saw nothing but wounded or dead Marines. 32 men were gone. He was alone on the ridge, facing nearly an entire regiment preparing for another charge. The Japanese reformed in the jungle below, shouting orders, boots slapping through mud. Page had 1 gun and perhaps 2,000 rounds, and he needed to hold until dawn, which was still 10 hours away. He seized the Browning M1917. The barrel glowed red from non-stop firing, and the water jacket was nearly empty. He no longer had crewmen to load belts, feed them, or keep the gun cool. He would have to do everything alone. Even though the weapon was designed for 3 men, its cloth belts held 250 rounds each and lasted barely more than 30 seconds under continuous fire. And normally, while 1 man fired, another fed a new belt, and a third carried water to keep the gun from seizing. Page now had to fire, reload, and cool the weapon himself as thousands of soldiers began shifting in the dark, preparing to attack again. He gripped the smoking gun, took a breath through the rain-filled air, and waited for the next wave, because if he failed here, Henderson Field would fall, and the entire Pacific War could turn on this single muddy ridge, held now by 1 wounded Marine who refused to abandon his post. When the next wave of Japanese soldiers surged up the slope at 6 a.m., Page opened fire again, even though he now had to manage the heavy Browning M 1917. Entirely alone, the gun jolted against his shoulder as steaming casings piled around him, and glowing tracers slashed down through the misty darkness, showing exactly where each burst landed. He saw bodies drop at 40 yards, then 30, then 20 as more and more soldiers pushed through their own fallen comrades, climbing over limbs and sliding through the rain-soaked mud. The first belt spat empty after barely half a minute. For a normal crew, this moment meant one Marine fed a new belt, while another watched the field, but Page had no crew. So he grabbed a fresh belt with his uninjured right hand. While his left hand bled freely from the earlier bayonet wound, his fingers trembled, yet he pushed the belt into the feed trigger. By touch alone, slammed the top cover closed and fired again, just as the enemy neared 15 yards, forcing them to stumble back under the withering line of fire. The rain hissed on the barrel and steam began pouring out of the water jacket by 7 a.m. The barrel was too hot to touch, and Page knew that if he kept firing without cooling the gun, the metal would warp and the weapon would seize completely. He crawled through sticky mud to the nearest Marine body, hoping the man still had a full canteen. The canteen was heavy when Page lifted it, and he unscrewed the cap and poured precious water into the jacket. The liquid boiled instantly, then he poured more, and the violent bubbling faded enough for another burst of fire. The Japanese pulled back, regrouped, and attacked again. At 8 a.m., the gun jammed. A spent casing had wedged inside the receiver. Page cleared it by feel, but after 3 more belts the receiver cracked from the stress and heat. The gun was finished, and smoke curled upward as rainwater sizzled against the broken weapon. Page left it where it lay, then crawled 30 yards through bodies to reach the second gun, whose crew lay dead beside it. He dragged the weapon back, inch by inch, mud swallowing his elbows as shells burst somewhere deeper in the jungle. Once back at his pit, he loaded the belt and fired into the next wave, which crashed forward at 9 a.m. The second gun was still cold and smooth, and he cut down attackers at 40 yards, at 30 yards, at 20 yards, even smelling the sharp mix of sweat, smoke, and blood as the sheer volume of enemy troops pushed closer than any earlier assault. The belt emptied. He reloaded and opened fire again for several minutes. The line held, then the Japanese pulled back again to regroup. Page, however, was weakening. His left sleeve was soaked in blood, his right leg throbbed from shrapnel, his ears rang until he could barely hear the gun. He had lost all sense of how many belts he had fired, or how many men the gun had cut down. All he knew was that the Japanese were not stopping, and neither could he at 10 a.m. Second gun, overheated like the first. Water in every canteen he could reach had already been used. His hands shook as he searched for anything that could cool the weapon. Training suddenly reminded him of a last resort. He urinated into the water jacket. The hot metal hissed and the smell rose sharply, but the barrel cooled enough to continue firing. At 11 a.m. Page had been fighting alone for 6 hours. The sun finally began pushing light through the treetops, revealing the slope below, now covered in hundreds of bodies, scattered from the ridge all the way into the jungle. As the Japanese fell back again, Page forced himself to crawl toward the third gun position. The Marines there were dead, but the gun was mostly intact except for a damaged tripod. Page dragged their ammunition back to his own position, stacking 12 heavy belts, nearly 3,000 rounds beside him. He checked what remained of the gun's. Gun 2 worked, but its barrel was worn from hours of firing. Gun 3 was usable even with its tripod damaged. Gun 4 was destroyed by a grenade. Page knew the enemy still had at least 2,000 men gathering in the tree line, 400 yards south. Soldiers tightened straps, checked rifles, and fixed bayonets. Officers leaned forward, shouting instructions for the next assault. The final push would come at noon, and Page understood that if he made even a single mistake, Henderson Field would fall by noon. The explosion of shouts ripped through the trees as the Japanese launched a coordinated assault from 3 directions. At least 200 enemy soldiers charged straight up the middle toward his position. Another 100 swept through the jungle on the left. Another 100 pushed up from the right. The tactic was clear. They meant to overwhelm him by forcing him to choose which direction to defend. Page refused to choose. He fired gun 2 into the center assault until the belt emptied, forcing many of the attackers to scatter or fall back. Then he seized gun 3 and fired quick bursts into the left flank, dropping the lead elements and slowing That push, he sprinted back to gun 2 reloaded and hammered the center again until those troops fell back. Then he swung gun 3 to the right and ripped into the third assault by shifting between the weapons every half minute. He made the Japanese believe multiple Marine machine gunners still defended the ridge for 20 minutes. The illusion worked, Japanese officers shouted to regroup. But then they realized only one gun fired at a time. The 3 assaults regrouped to strike simultaneously. Page braced his exhausted body as hundreds of soldiers prepared to push forward once more, and he knew he was reaching the limit of what any one man could hold alone. At 12:30 p.m., the Japanese assault on the right flank finally broke through the tangled jungle and reached the top of the ridge barely 70 yards from Page's position, and he saw a small enemy team rushing to set up a knee mortar, which if allowed to fire even a single round would destroy his last defensive line and end the battle in seconds. Page seized gun 3, swung the barrel toward the right flank, and poured an entire belt into the mortar crew, dropping them before they could launch a round. But while he was focused on the right, the center attack surged again, pushing to within 30 yards and forcing him to whip the gun back and fire burst after burst into the dense mass of charging soldiers. He was losing ground on all sides. He could not protect the right and the center and the left at the same time, and the Japanese had finally coordinated their attacks perfectly so that wherever he turned 2 other assaults advanced unopposed. He needed help desperately, but none came, and the ridge felt smaller and tighter with every passing minute. The mud-soaked bodies of his friends lay around him, and his hands shook from exhaustion, blood, loss, and shock. His left hand had nearly been sliced open by the earlier bayonet wound, and every time he tightened his grip, a sharp bolt of pain shot up his arm. His right leg was burning from shrapnel. His entire body felt as if it had been stretched beyond all limits. Still, he would not abandon the ridge. At 1 p.m., a sound rose. Behind him, American voices shouting commands and shifting through the foliage. Then he heard the familiar tone of Marine rifles firing. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller, known to his men as Chesty, was leading 2 rifle companies from the battalion reserve straight up the ridge. They numbered about 40 men, and as soon as they reached Page's position, they spread out, taking up places along the line and opening fire on the center and flanking assaults. The Japanese advance stalled temporarily. Puller crawled up beside Page, and his eyes scanned the ridge, taking in the bodies of the platoon. Wrecked guns, the mountains of spent belts, and the single surviving Marine covered in mud and blood, still firing the Browning machine gun. Puller asked Page whether he could hold until more reinforcements arrived. Page nodded and said he could hold as long as he had ammunition. Puller did not waste time. He positioned riflemen to cover the flanks. He dragged up 2 additional machine guns to support Page's exhausted ones. Then he called for artillery support from the batteries behind Henderson Field, and within minutes the distant thump of American howitzers filled the air. A series of 105mm shells began erupting in the Japanese assembly areas 400 yards south, breaking up their attempt to regroup. The enemy advance halted, but Page understood this was only a pause. The Japanese still outnumbered the Marines 10-1, and they still had fresh troops in thick jungle. The next attack would come, and when it did, he would again be behind a machine gun fighting for a ridge that could not be lost. At 2 p.m., the anticipated assault began. The Japanese sent 500 soldiers charging straight up the slope without flanking diversions or probing attacks. They were relying solely on mass to overwhelm the Americans. The American artillery dropped more shells into the oncoming wave, killing dozens, but still hundreds pushed forward. Marine riflemen fired steadily, cutting down attackers, but more kept advancing. The line trembled under the sheer force of bodies pushing upward. Page fired belt after belt into the center. Mass and the ground shook with explosions and screams. The Japanese closed to 50 yards, then 40, then 30. When they reached 30 yards, Page's machine gun jammed. A casing had stuck in the ejection port, and he used his fighting knife to pry it free, slammed the cover shut, and fired again. The gun worked for 10 seconds, then jammed again. The receiver had taken too much punishment from hours of non-stop firing, and the weapon was finished. The gun hung silent as the Japanese closed in. Puller, locking eyes with Page, instantly understood that with the machine gun down, the line would collapse. The Japanese were only seconds away from reaching the ridge, and if they broke through, Henderson Field would fall, the Marines would lose Guadalcanal, and the Pacific would shift in Japan's favor. Puller made a decision that seemed impossible. He shouted for every Marine to fix bayonets. They were going to countercharge downhill into 500 advancing Japanese soldiers. It was suicide, but it was also the only option. If they stayed in their positions, they would be overrun. If they charged, they might shock the enemy long enough to break the momentum and save the airfield. Puller raised his rifle and asked who would lead the charge. Page, already rising despite his injuries, stepped forward. He had been fighting for 12 hours. He had held the ridge alone for 6 of those hours. He had killed more Japanese soldiers than he could count. His hands were torn. His leg was cut open. His entire body trembled from exhaustion, yet he still had fight left in him. He lifted his M1903. Springfield fixed his bayonet and stared down the slope at the vast force climbing toward him. Puller shouted the order. Page lunged forward, and 40 Marines sprinted behind him, charging downhill into a mass of 500 Japanese soldiers, who had no reason to fear such a small force until they saw the man leading it and the determination in his eyes. When the bayonet charge began at 2:15 p.m., Page was the first Marine to hurl himself down the muddy slope, his boots sinking into the thick ground, as 40 Marines followed behind him, and the 500 Japanese soldiers climbing upward paused in disbelief at the sight of a force so small. Charging straight into them for 11 relentless hours, the Japanese had attacked this ridge, sending wave after wave, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. And now the Americans who had inflicted all those casualties were rushing toward them, with bayonets raised. The hesitation among the front ranks lasted only a few seconds, but in combat, a few seconds can decide an entire battle. Some Japanese soldiers glanced over their shoulders at the endless line of their dead covering the slope from top to bottom, and whatever courage they had left began to crumble. They had charged this ridge many times, and every time they had been repelled by a single machine gunner. And now that same machine gunner was leading a charge directly into their faces. The officers screamed for their men to hold the line. They raised their swords, trying to force obedience, but fear spread faster than discipline, and the entire forward line broke like water against rock. Men turned and ran back down the slope, pushing through their own ranks as officers tried desperately to restore order. The Marines collided with what remained of the front Japanese ranks. Page reached the first enemy soldier with full momentum. Driving his bayonet into the man's chest, the blade sank deep but stuck fast, and when Page tried to wrench it free, it would not budge. He released the rifle and drew his K.R. knife just as another Japanese soldier swung a rifle butt toward his head. Page blocked with his injured left arm, feeling a surge of pain as the wound split open again. Then he plunged the knife into the attacker's stomach. As that man fell, another rushed from the right. Page lashed out with a swift kick, striking the soldier's knee and dropping him before finishing him with a downward stab. Marines all along the slope were fighting in brutal close quarters using bayonets, rifle butts, and knives. The Japanese line dissolved completely. Soldiers streamed back toward the jungle, and although officers tried to gather them, the panic was too strong. Within minutes, what had begun as a 500-man assault had turned into a frantic retreat. Page chased the fleeing soldiers nearly 50 yards down the slope before hearing Lieutenant Colonel Puller shouting for everyone to pull back to the ridge. Puller knew that if the Marines pursued too far, they could be surrounded by fresh Japanese units waiting in the jungle, and the ridge which had cost so many lives might be lost to a counterattack. Page obeyed and climbed back up through the mud, the adrenaline fading and exhaustion hitting him like a blow. His body finally reacted to the hours of combat. His hands trembled so violently he could not grip his rifle. His left hand felt nearly useless from the bayonet wound. Blood covered both sleeves, and a steady trail ran down his right leg from shrapnel. He had not eaten since the night before. He had not slept in 36 hours. His muscles felt like lead, and every breath scraped his lungs. He had been fighting for 13 straight hours, and now that the charge was over, his body felt as though it would collapse under its own weight. Puller reached him first, offering water as a corpsman tried to bandage his hand, but Page waved the corpsman away, insisting the wound could wait because he believed the Japanese would regroup and attack again. They always attacked again. The ridge lay silent at 3 p.m. The only sounds were the rain tapping leaves and the groans of wounded men. By 4 p.m., Nothing had changed still. No movement came from the jungle. Marine patrols cautiously advanced down the slope, counting bodies. As they went, they found 473 Japanese soldiers dead directly in front of Page's original machine gun line. Alone bodies lay stacked in layers across the mud, a silent testament to the ferocity of the hours before. At 5 p.m., word came from battalion headquarters. The Japanese were withdrawing. The battle for Henderson Field was over. The Marines had held the airfield, and with it they held the future of the Pacific Campaign. Page sat behind the shattered remains of his machine gun, staring at the jungle where thousands had attacked, and only silence now remained. He had held this ridge for 15 hours, fighting alone for 6 of those hours, firing thousands of rounds, and holding back an entire regiment. His platoon of 33 Marines was gone. All 32 of his men were either dead or wounded. He alone remained when an officer from regimental headquarters arrived. At 6 p.m., collecting after-action reports, he asked Page to summarize what had happened. Page answered plainly: 1 platoon sergeant, 33 Marines, 4 machine guns, 2,700 Japanese soldiers. The officer wrote it down, then asked how many enemy soldiers Page believed he had personally killed. Page gave the only answer he could. He did not know. He had stopped counting after the first 100 as the sun set at 7 p.m. and dim yellow light faded behind the distant treetops. Page finally let the corpsman treat his mangled hand. The bayonet blade had sliced tendons and nearly severed 2 fingers. The corpsman insisted he needed surgery, but Page refused until his fallen Marines were buried in the pale light of the evening. He helped carry bodies of friends he had trained, fought beside, and watched die. He had survived, but the cost lay all around him in the quiet mud of the ridge. Henderson Field was secure. The Marines had held, and the Japanese withdrawal meant the island would remain in American hands. The victory would shape the entire Pacific War. But Page did not think of strategy. He thought only of the 32 Marines who did not rise from the ridge, of the debt he owed them for the rest of his life. The day after the battle, on October 27th, the Marines began gathering detailed reports, and Colonel Puller immediately recommended Mitchell Page for the Medal of Honor, recognizing that his stand had held the entire southern line and prevented the fall of Henderson Field weeks later on. December 19, 1942, Page was promoted in the field to 2nd lieutenant. Then, on May 21, 1943, in Melbourne, Australia, Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift personally placed the Medal of Honor around Page's neck. Page did not treat the medal as something to display. He placed it in a cigar box and mailed it home to his parents before returning to combat. He fought at Cape Gloucester, he fought in New Guinea, and he stayed in the Pacific Theater until July 1944. He rarely spoke about Guadalcanal unless someone asked him directly, and even then he answered with the same direct simplicity. Years after the war, historians tried to understand the full scale of what Page had done during those 6 solitary hours of fighting. They studied battlefield maps, ammunition counts, and the Japanese unit records to estimate number of enemy troops he had personally killed. Even the most conservative calculations showed that Page alone had killed around 140 Japanese soldiers during those hours, and perhaps more in the earlier waves before he found himself alone. The weapon that made this possible, the Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun, had been designed in 1917 by John Moses Browning. It fired 30 caliber rounds from a cloth belt at a rate of 450 rounds per minute. The heavy steel barrel was encased in a water jacket that allowed continuous firing without warping, but only if water was constantly added. Without water, the barrel would reach a glowing red after 200 rounds, and would warp after 500 rounds. The gun weighed 93 pounds fully loaded, and its tripod weighed 53 pounds. A full ammunition can weigh 22 pounds. Each belt held 250 rounds, enough for roughly 33 seconds of non-stop fire. In training, Marines learned that it took a crew of 3 to operate the gun effectively. 1 Marine fired and aimed, 1 fed the belt and cleared jams, 1 carried spare ammunition and water. The loader had to feed the cloth belt at just the right pace, or the weapon would jam. A twist in the belt would stop the gun instantly. The gunner had to feel the rhythm of the weapon and sense changes in recoil and barrel heat. Page had practiced this for 6 years before Guadalcanal. He had fired more rounds in training than many Marines ever fired in comm, but he knew by instinct exactly when a jam was forming. He knew the difference in vibration between a belt feeding smoothly and a belt about to snag. He could tell from the sound of the water jacket when the barrel needed cooling. He understood the machine not just as a weapon, but almost as a living system that he could read by touch and sound. Most Marines trained for 6 months. Page had trained for 72 months. Most Marines fired around 5,000 rounds in preparation. Page had fired tens of thousands. Most Marines learned the mechanics. Page learned the soul of the gun. This level of understanding explains how Page kept the weapon firing for the first several hours when he still had men to help him, but historians are quick to point out that training alone does not explain how he continued for 6 hours. Completely alone, adrenaline plays a role in combat. The human body creates a burst of energy under extreme stress, allowing feats that normally seem impossible. But adrenaline lasts only minutes before the body crashes under exhaustion, not hours. Page fought for 6 hours without rest while bleeding from multiple wounds. Medical studies after World War II examined combat performance under sustained stress and showed that after 2 hours, fine motor skills begin to break down. After 4 hours, decision-making becomes unreliable. After 6 hours, most soldiers reach complete physical and mental exhaustion. Page, however, was clearing jams, reloading belts, selecting firing angles, dragging guns through mud, and making tactical choices under constant attack. His body should have collapsed around hour 3, yet he kept fighting. Some argue that his long years of training created muscle memory so deep that he no longer needed conscious control, that loading, firing, cooling, and troubleshooting had become automatic movements that his body executed, even while his mind stretched toward the limit. This is partially true, but still does not fully explain his endurance. Another factor was psychological. Page understood beyond any doubt what was at stake. If he stopped firing, Henderson Field would fall. If Henderson Field fell, the Japanese would dominate the Pacific. If they dominated the Pacific, then the ships and supply lines that connected the United States to Australia would collapse. Page knew that he and his 33-man platoon were the only barrier between the Japanese and victory. That weight of responsibility can push a person far past the normal human limit. But even this was not the deepest reason Page kept fighting. The fourth reason, the one most historians mention only quietly, was personal. Page was not fighting for strategy or maps or the future of the Pacific in those moments. He was fighting for the 32 Marines who had died around him. Men he had trained shoulder to shoulder, men he had eaten beside, men he had marched with, men he had promised to lead and protect. When they died, he did not run. He chose instead to make their sacrifice mean something. The Japanese would not take the ridge. The Japanese would not reach the airfield. His men would not have died for nothing. That resolve drove him more powerfully than training, adrenaline, or strategy combined. They fueled a human being far beyond normal endurance. The battle for Henderson Field itself was a massive engagement lasting from October 23rd through October 26, 1942. The Japanese 17th Army brought nearly 7,000 men into the offensive, while the Americans had roughly 3,000 Marines and soldiers. The Japanese plan involved simultaneous attacks across the entire perimeter in hopes of breaking through at least one point. If they succeeded, the Marines would be driven into the sea and the island retaken. The heaviest attacks fell on the nights of October 24th and October 26th. Page's sector was just one part of a vast battle, but it was one of the most decisive. If the Japanese had broken through his line, they could have struck Henderson Field from the south. At the same time, other units attacked from the east and west, creating a collapse that no reinforcement could stop. Page's platoon suffered 97% casualties. 32 of 33 men were killed or wounded. Only Page remained to tell their story. But because he held the ridge, Henderson Field survived. Because Henderson Field survived, so did the Pacific Campaign. And because the Pacific Campaign survived, the course of World War II shifted entirely from that muddy ridge, where one Marine refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed inevitable. Page's sector was not the only part of the perimeter that endured overwhelming attacks that week. The night of October 24th, only 2 nights before Page's solitary stand, another Marine machine gunner, Sergeant John Basilone, faced a similarly massive assault on a different approach. Henderson Field, his position lay northeast of Page's Ridge, and his guns were struck by nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the 29th Infantry Regiment. The attack began at 9 p.m., and within 2 hours Basilione's machine gun crews were nearly out of ammunition, forcing him to make repeated runs through open ground swept by Japanese fire to bring belts forward. From the rear, he carried ammunition draped across his shoulders, running bent beneath the weight as mortar shells exploded around him, and enemy rifles snapped in the dark. He made 4 dangerous trips, each time bringing enough ammunition to keep his guns firing for only a short period before he had to run again when 2 of his machine guns jammed under the pressure of constant firing. Basilone repaired them on the spot in the midst of the Japanese advance, and when his gunners fell wounded, he took their place and fired for hour after hour. By dawn, his section had killed roughly 900 enemy soldiers, and though almost every Marine with him was wounded, the position held. Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions. That night, 2 days later, Page would receive the same recognition for his own stand. Though the 2 men fought in different sectors separated by 2 miles of jungle and never saw each other during the battle, their experiences reflected the same brutal truth, that the defense of Henderson Field relied on a handful of men willing to endure the impossible Japanese casualties. Throughout the 4-day battle were catastrophic. American patrols counted roughly 2,000 Japanese dead across all sectors, with thousands more wounded. The 17th Army had committed around 7,000 troops, nearly half of whom became casualties as their repeated assaults crumbled. Against the Marine lines, the survivors were in such poor condition that the Japanese offensive had effectively ended. They no longer possessed the strength to mount another coordinated attack. American casualties, though far lower, were still severe: 206 killed and 346 wounded. Entire companies were reduced to half strength. Entire platoons were wiped out. Page's platoon suffered 97% casualties, losing 32 of its 33 men. In only a few hours, the strategic consequences of what happened on October 26th were enormous and long-lasting. Henderson Field remained in American hands, allowing bombers to continue striking Japanese supply convoys that attempted to reinforce the island. Those bombers cut off the Japanese garrison from food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, making it impossible for the Japanese to regain the initiative. Within 2 months, the Japanese High Command accepted that Guadalcanal could not be held. They began planning a full evacuation of the island. In hindsight, historians identify the defense of Henderson Field as the decisive turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign. Before the battle, the outcome was uncertain. The Japanese still believed they could throw the Americans back into the sea and reclaim the airfield. After the battle, their defeat was inevitable. The Americans had proved they could withstand the strongest attacks the Japanese could launch. The Japanese had proved that no matter how many troops they committed, they could not retake the airfield. Page's stand was one small part of this larger struggle, but it was a critical one. If the Japanese had broken through the southern ridge, they would have struck the airfield while other Japanese units attacked from the east and west. The Marines would have been encircled and overwhelmed. The collapse of the perimeter would have forced the Americans to abandon the island. Henderson Field would have been destroyed, and the Japanese would have retained control of the Solomon Islands. The Pacific War would have taken a completely different direction. Every strategist who studied the campaign understood that the fate of the Pacific rested on a few key locations at key moments. And on October 26th, that location was the Muddy Ridge, where one Marine held the line against nearly an entire regiment. The magnitude of what Page endured and prevented can only be understood when imagining the alternative. If Henderson Field had fallen, American aircraft would have lost their ability to strike Japanese supply routes. Without those aircraft, the Japanese could have reinforced their positions across the Pacific, establishing a chain of strongholds too powerful to dislodge. The American island hopping strategy, which relied on seizing airfields to support further operations, would have been delayed by years if it remained possible at all. The cost in lives would have been enormous. Thousands of sailors, Marines, and soldiers would have died in extended campaigns that the Japanese would have been far better positioned to resist. The entire Pacific timetable would have shifted, and the turning points of later battles in the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa might never have unfolded in the same way. The outcome of World War II in the Pacific hinged on many factors, but few moments were as pivotal as the defense of Henderson Field. Page's determination transformed the battle from a near collapse into a defining victory. It is easy to overlook how narrow the margin truly was the difference between victory and defeat. On that ridge was 33 Marines, only one of whom survived to the end, but because that one Marine refused to fall back, refused to surrender, refused to let the Japanese cross the ridge, the entire Pacific War moved forward on a new path. When historians revisit the battle, they often return to a single image, the sight of Page moving from gun to gun in darkness, smoke, mud, and rain, fighting alone against a force that outnumbered him nearly 100 to 1. That image has become a symbol of Guadalcanal itself, a campaign defined by exhaustion, hunger, disease, and relentless combat. Yet through endurance beyond anything the human body should withstand, Page did not fight for medals or glory. He fought because 32 Marines lay dead around him, men he had trained, men he had led, men he believed deserved to have their sacrifice mean something. He fought because the ridge could not fall, and because if he gave up, the entire battle would be lost. And in the end, he endured long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough for the Japanese assault to collapse, long enough to hold the line that changed the course of a war. Mitchell Page lived for decades after Guadalcanal, yet he carried the memory of those 32 Marines with him until the day he died on November 15th, 2003. Page passed away at his home in Loma Linda, California, from congestive heart failure at 85 years old. He had retired from the Marine Corps in 1959 with the rank of colonel after 24 years of service, but throughout his life he never spoke about Henderson Field unless someone asked directly, and even then he minimized his own role, always insisting the Medal of Honor belonged to all. 33 Marines on the ridge, not just to him, but Page did something after the war that revealed how deeply the memory of his platoon stayed with him, something he dedicated decades of his life to completing, and it reflected the same fierce loyalty he had shown on Guadalcanal in the years. Following World War, two problems emerged concerning the Medal of Honor. More and more individuals began falsely claiming they had received the award. Some wore counterfeit medals at public events. Some invented combat stories that never happened. Some lied to gain benefits and attention. These false claims were not minor offenses. They insulted the men who had faced death with courage beyond ordinary human limits. They diminished the honor of every soldier and Marine who had acted with extraordinary bravery. They especially dishonored those who did not survive. Congress responded by passing laws that made it a federal crime to falsely claim receipt of the Medal of Honor, but enforcing the law proved difficult. Records from the war were not always accessible. Local police departments usually lacked the authority or resources to investigate such claims, and many false recipients continued their deception for years without consequence. Page refused to allow that. He became personally committed to protecting the integrity of the award. He joined the Congressional Medal of Honor Society as a liaison officer, working closely with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When someone claimed to be a Medal of Honor recipient, Page would carefully verify their name and story against official military records. If the claim was false, he reported it to the FBI, which would then investigate and prosecute. When possible, Page traveled across the country, attending events, inspecting medals, asking questions, and examining the stories of those who claimed to have earned the award. He had no patience for fraud. Each time he discovered a false claim, he pushed relentlessly for accountability, because to him, the Medal of Honor represented something sacred. It represented 32 Marines on a ridge. In Guadalcanal, it represented the men who had died with rifles in their hands, and the men who never came home. Page understood that when someone wore a medal they had not earned, they were stealing honor from men who had faced impossible combat, and had paid with their lives. This was not an abstract insult. Page saw the faces of his platoon whenever he encountered a fraudulent medal. Wherever he saw the ridge, the bodies, the mud, the rain, he remembered the voices of the men who had trusted him to lead them. And he remembered how every one of them had fought to the last breath. If anyone had the right to defend the meaning of the Medal of Honor, it was Page, and he embraced that duty. He continued these investigations for decades, even as his health declined. He personally helped identify dozens of fraudulent claimants, leading to legal action against many of them. His work protected the value of Medal of Honor for future generations and ensured that real recipients such as Sergeant John Basilone, who died at Iwo Jima in 1945, were honored appropriately. In 1998, the toy company Hasbro released a G.I. Joe action figure modeled after Mitchell Page. The figure wore a Marine Corps uniform and carried a machine gun The intention was to honor each branch of the military with a Medal of Honor representative, and Page was chosen for the United States Marine Corps. The figure came packaged with a small booklet explaining his actions at Guadalcanal. Thousands of children collected it, and in households across America, young people learned for the first time about the lone Marine who held a ridge against an entire regiment. For Page, this recognition mattered only because it helped preserve the memory of the men who had died under his command in 1999. Page received a star on the Palm Springs Walk of Stars honoring him. As one of the Medal of Honor recipients from the Southern California desert region, veterans groups attended the ceremony, and Page gave a short speech in which he insisted that the star belonged to all Marines. Fought on Guadalcanal, not to him personally, a museum at Marine Corps Base, 29 Palms dedicated an exhibit to him displaying his uniform, his Medal of Honor, and artifacts from the battle visitors could stand before the same type of Browning M 1917 machine gun he had used. They could read his citation, they could learn why Henderson Field mattered, and why one muddy ridge had changed the Pacific War. Thousands of young Marines walked past these displays, absorbing the story of the man whose endurance had become legend on March 23, 2003, 8 months before his death. Page finally received his Eagle Scout Award. He had earned the rank in 1936 at age 17, but never received the physical badge because he left immediately to join the Marine Corps. After 67 years, the Boy Scouts of America held a ceremony to present it, making him one of only 7 men in history to be both an Eagle Scout and a Medal of Honor recipient. When Page died later that year, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. John Basilone had died on Iwo Jima. The others gradually passed over decades, leaving Page as the final living witness to what happened on Henderson Field in 1942. He was buried at Riverside National Cemetery with full military honors. Marines in dress, blue uniforms carried his casket. A rifle party fired 3 volleys and a bugler played taps. The folded flag was presented to his family. Hundreds of Marines attended the funeral standing silent as the man who had defined what it meant to hold a line was laid to rest. The official Medal of Honor citation describes his stand with precise military wording, stating that he continued directing the fire of his gunners until all were killed or wounded, that he fought alone under intense enemy fire, that he moved from gun to gun, delivering relentless fire against advancing forces, and that he later led a dangerous bayonet charge to prevent a break. Through these words are accurate, but they do not reveal true weight of what he accomplished. They do not explain why the ridge mattered. They do not explain why the airfield mattered. They do not explain how the fate of the Pacific hinged on one man refusing to stop fighting on a rain-soaked ridge at dawn. They do not tell the story of 32 Marines whose sacrifice gave that ridge meaning. Page lived the rest of his life ensuring that their honor would never be stolen or forgotten, because in the end everything he did on Guadalcanal and everything he did afterward was for them. The official Medal of Honor citation for Mitchell Page describes his actions in precise formal language, but the true significance of what happened on that ridge reaches far beyond the sentences carved into military records. It states that he continued directing the fire of his gunners until every man was killed or wounded. It states that he remained alone under a storm of enemy shells, firing from position to position, delivering unbroken fire into the advancing Japanese. It states that he then led a fearless bayonet charge, driving the enemy back and preventing a break. Through those words are accurate, yet they cannot fully capture why the battle mattered or what the ridge truly represented. Henderson Field at that moment, in October 1942, was the only fully operational American airfield in the Solomon Islands. Without it, American bombers could not strike Japanese supply convoys. Without those strikes, Japan would have been free to reinforce and resupply its positions across the Pacific, creating a chain of strongholds. The United States would have struggled to breach. The Japanese understood this perfectly, which is why they committed roughly 7,000 soldiers to reclaiming the airfield. They launched repeated assaults and accepted catastrophic losses in the attempt, because in their calculation, Henderson Field was worth any price. If Page's sector had collapsed on October 26th, the Japanese would have reached the airfield from the south, while other Japanese units pushed from the east and west, forming a pincer that no amount of artillery or rifle fire could have stopped. They would have destroyed the American aircraft lined along the runway They would have seized the fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and communication centers. The Marines would have been forced to evacuate Guadalcanal, leaving the island firmly under Japanese control. The first American offensive in the Pacific would have ended in failure. The consequences would have rippled outward with enormous force. Every step of the Pacific strategy relied on seizing islands and building airfields that allowed the next push forward. Guadalcanal was the first major test of that strategy. If it failed here, planners would have questioned whether the island-hopping campaign could succeed at all without Henderson Field. The United States would have needed far larger fleets, far more men, and far more time to counter Japanese expansion. The timeline of the Pacific War would have extended by years, and the cost in American lives would have soared. Battles like Tarawa Sap and late Gulf, Iwo Jima and Okinawa might have unfolded at entirely different scales, or perhaps not unfolded at all. Japanese control hardened across the Central Pacific. It is not an exaggeration to say that the endurance of one Marine on one ridge helped prevent a devastating shift in the course of the war. But these vast strategic consequences, though important, do not convey the deepest truth of the story, which is far more human. Page understood in that moment that he was not simply holding a military position, he was carrying the weight of 32 fallen Marines men. He had trained men, he had marched beside men who trusted him to lead them into battle, and who died fulfilling their duty. Those Marines had held their ground against impossible odds until they had no strength left, and Page believed with absolute conviction that their sacrifice needed to mean something. He refused to let the Japanese pass, not because he believed himself unbreakable, but because he believed the lives of his men deserved to stand for something greater. He fought for them, he endured for them, he bled for them, and long after the guns fell silent, he continued to honor them. When he confronted fraudulent Medal of Honor claimants decades later, it was not out of anger or pride, but out of loyalty. He refused to allow anyone to steal honor from men who earned it with their blood. His work with the FBI, his speeches, his defense of the award, all of it echoed the same principle that had kept him on that ridge, that the honor of his men was sacred and must never be tarnished. Page's legacy today lives not only in museums, not only in military records, not only in the memorials that bear his name, but in the thousands of Marines who learned his story as recruits, who studied the Battle of Guadalcanal and discovered what it meant to fight with total commitment. His life became a message passed from generation to generation. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to break when everything inside a person screams to stop. When Page died, he left behind no boastful memoir and no lengthy speeches. Instead, he left behind the memory of one impossible stand, a stand that shaped the future of a war and preserved the honor of men whose names most people never learned. He left behind a story of endurance, loyalty, and sacrifice that continues to echo through the halls of Marine Corps bases and through every historical account of Guadalcanal. His funeral reflected that legacy. Hundreds of Marines gathered in silent formation. They watched as the bugler played taps and the folded flag was handed to his family. They honored not only the man, but the platoon he had led and the ridge they had held together, because even though he was the only one who survived to the end, he never once claimed the victory as his own. To him, it belonged to all 33 Marines, forever bound together by the mud, rain, fire, and blood of that ridge at its core. The story of Mitchell Page is not only about a machine gun or a ridge or a single battle. It is about the incredible weight carried by one Marine when the fate of the entire campaign and the lives of countless future soldiers depended on him standing his ground. It is about the courage of ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. It is about sacrifice willingly made and honor fiercely protected long after the battlefield fell silent. And it is about what can happen when one human being refuses to surrender even when facing what should have been certain death. Page understood that October 26, 1942 was not simply a moment in a war. It was the moment when the future of the Pacific balanced on a knife edge, and he chose to stand. He chose to fight, he chose to endure, so the men who had fallen beside him would not be forgotten, and so that the world they fought for would remain free in the end. That is the legacy of the ridge, the legacy of Henderson Field, and the legacy of Mitchell Page. A legacy written not in medals or in speeches, but in the unbreakable resolve of a Marine who knew that some lines must never be allowed to fall. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.